all over the world. I'll go a little bit into the details of why MOG is important and what are the things that we do. Just to give an idea, there are a number of like almost 200 to 300 members that are companies that are actually participating in MOG, and we are seeing more and more participation every year. So what do we do? MOG is quite literally if you think about all of the people in your organizations who are keeping your networks running, keeping your mail servers running, keeping all of your infrastructure running, right? Think about those people and taking all of those people and bringing them together in a closed, trusted environment to work together and deal with all the problems collectively. So a lot of the stuff that MOG does is that they work on developing best practices and kind of guides to help everybody around the world in terms of operating the internet and the infrastructure correctly. To give an example, earlier actually I gave a presentation, rather a training on DDoS mitigation. It was a 90-minute training which kind of covered a lot of different topics that collectively the DDoS working group within MOG actually has been working over the past few years, and it kind of helps you share the collective knowledge, right? And if you think about collaboration, policy, and education, so this kind of a lot of the work around MOG is around collaboration and education. So in terms of looking at the types of outputs, I just mentioned about best practices. MOG also publishes what I call as technical white papers. There is also a public policy aspect of it, which I'll cover a little bit later in one of the slides. But I think this is also about work with governments, trying to work with other public policy people in terms of defining how internet and the rules around who can do what on the internet are being managed and governed. So how does MOG work? So MOG has this notion of what is called as working group. Well, MOG itself is a working group, but there are technical committees within MOG, and I'll go through a few of the technical committees to kind of give you an example of what they do. And as I mentioned, right, the main goal here is to sort of create a circle of trust, or rather kind of a group of collaborators who have the shared problem, right? So I can actually be competitors with, my company can be a competitor with somebody else from another company, but when we are participating in MOG or we are working in MOG, there's sort of a trust established, right? That you are actually working on the same side, you're sharing the same problems, and regardless of which company I work for, whether you are a competitor or I'm a competitor, we are all working to make sure that the abuse on the internet and the abuse to our infrastructure stops happening, because we all have sort of a common problem and a common enemy, right? The people who are abusing our networks. And that's really kind of one of the most important things about MOG, is to provide this closed, trusted environment where you can talk about things that your lawyers would typically not allow you to talk anywhere else, right? So that's kind of one of the biggest advantage. To give an example of how MOG has been actually participating, so MOG actually does work with a number of different organizations around the world, including sometimes influencing IETF and standards bodies, working with NANOG, and a couple of examples are here are based on MOG. We actually worked with LACNIC and the Latin American community to form what is now called as a LAC-OG, which is the same format and kind of organization, but focused on the Latin American community. Same thing, there was one that was formed for Japan. And me being here is kind of one of the reasons why we are looking at trying to form a similar organization or a similar structure even for Africa. So that's kind of one of the discussions that's happening to improve collaboration. Now, just to give an idea of what MOG does or what are the things that has happened, I'll just go through quickly on what are the things that MOG did in 2019. So that's kind of to give you an idea of what kind of things that happen. So MOG actually has 3 conferences that they hold through the year. The first one usually is in San Francisco during the February timeframe. That's always in San Francisco. The second one, they usually do it sometime in the June timeframe, which is usually either in US or somewhere in Europe. So they try to do it at different locations. Mostly it's US or Europe. And then the third one also depending upon the location, it could be somewhere in North America, sometimes it's Canada. So to give an example, last year, the October 2019, or this year's last conference was in Montreal, where we actually had about 490 attendees and from 27 different countries. We always see more and more new attendees coming every time. And there's a lot of kind of material. It's kind of similar to the conference here, where on the first day you actually have how to engage, how to continue participation, newcomers guide, and all of those things. As I talked about, right, MOG is formed in the form of committees. So there are different committees that focuses on different problems that are that we all deal with as, as infrastructure providers. An example of that is the Abuse Desk Committee, which actually focuses on, improving best practices and guides on how Abuse Desk and abuse people can be trained, right, to deal with specific things. And this is just an example. I'm just going to go through very quickly the brand SIG. This is another example of SIG is a special interest group that usually falls under a specific committee. So usually, if there is a very focused on narrow area of work that everybody's interested in, then they actually also form a working group or special interest group. There's some work going on data and identity protection and specifically privacy. That's one of the things that has sort of been becoming very relevant around the world. People are getting more and more aware about privacy requirements and keeping their own data private. So there's work happening on that front. Another example is the data protection and identity protection. That also again goes towards the same focus. The DDoS SIG. So I am actually the co-chair for the DDoS SIG, and I just mentioned earlier, right? I'm here actually on behalf of the DDoS SIG to give a training that I gave earlier on DDoS mitigation. This one actually is an interesting one. So the public policy. This kind of goes less towards, well, it is technical, but it focuses more on how do you actually deal with things like, so to give an example, after the Christchurch attack in New Zealand, right? So when there was that hate crime, then actually the New Zealand government came to MOG to talk about, okay, how do we actually have a mechanism or a proper, best practices in place to, be able to identify these kinds of, material or bad abuse of the internet for hate crimes and things like that, and how do we actually take action against it as a whole community, regardless of what country you are, right? This affects all of us. MOG is also working with GSMA and the 5G community to work on as 5G comes, there are of course going to be more other issues around 5G, around data protection, data identity, privacy, and MOG is kind of collaborating with them on, understanding what the implications are and kind of starting to get a head start on best practices. So those are kind of just an example of the things that MOG does. And this is something that we all, I guess, need to do, regardless of whether you are, which geographical region you are in. A lot of the other work that MOG does is also outreach. Again, me standing here is part of, outreach. And there's also an organization called this MESSEU, which is an organization of the European operators. And MOG is engaging with them to kind of start propagating some of these best practices, getting feedback from them in terms of how are the best practices working and things like that. The next MOG meeting is going to be, again, as I mentioned, right, the first meeting of every year is always in San Francisco. It's just kind of been traditionally like that because there's always a whole bunch of, it's the Silicon Valley, right? So there are a lot of companies there, a lot of companies that actually have their infrastructure and network operations teams there. So we get good participation there, but then we also try to rotate it around the world. So if you are interested in attending one of these meetings, there's actually, like, usually you have to be a MOG member to attend, but there are ways in which you can actually register as a non-member, and there are even special mechanisms for you to be able to attend, and if you want to take the information back for your working groups. So I think I'm done. That's all I had. So if you have any questions or comments, you can actually send the email to Severin Boker. I think there's an email there. As I mentioned, he's the chair for the MOG SIG, and he would be able to answer. Or you can reach out to me after this meeting or anytime in the next 2 days, and I'll be able to happy to help you or provide any answers. So that's it.